rivers, walls, tombs, and light. In this lecture, we'll review the last lecture. We'll talk about competition and crossing paths, and we'll review the contributions of Arab and Chinese cultures to the history of science. Last but not least, we'll talk about an idea I call Table for One. In the early part of the course, technology and architectural sites stand in for science in the sense that large projects leave an imprint on the historical record. They require mathematical skills, and they are evidence that people are looking around, deciding to tackle a problem with resources that go well beyond what an individual could muster. The Hagia Sophia is a good example of a space that was built a couple of hundred years after the aqueducts we looked at, but by people who preserved the same engineering skills. This is a quick look at ancient accomplishments. Some we understand in terms of motivation, and some we don't fully. All of them required incredible organization and mass production of material. To do these things, there had to be a pool of knowledge. The pool almost certainly included a strong knowledge of the stars, and definitely included a knowledge of how to quarry and move massive weights, and the physics of moving water. We also said that the written record was one way to count the beginning of science, and that the Babylonians appear to have been well ahead in terms of mathematics and following the movement of the planets. I also said there were a few things to keep your eye on: the atom and the universe, and everything in between, which is us. What problems do we choose to pursue and think are good to solve and care about knowing and predicting within the natural world and the psychological world around us? That's what science grapples with. In summary, so far we have looked at the definition of science. We asked, what is progress really? And we also asked, out of all the things that happened in the past, how do we know what really matters? If we take the definition of science to be repeated observations using instruments to draw conclusions about mysterious forces and how we can predict them, then we also asked, when can we start the story of science? We looked at prehistoric science as well as ancient Greece and Rome. And I said you should keep your eye on some important questions: the smallest building block, the atom, the size and shape of the universe, the nature of time. I said you should also think about where we see a sink of wealth which attracts scientists and science, and don't forget to keep track of influential thinkers. One thing you may be wondering, when did they start using algebra? Who discovered chromosomes? How did they discover the nucleus? Can you just tell us when people in the past discovered what we know now? And I think you have to understand that we want to look at history from the perspective of the people living it. A good history class tries to look at history from the perspective of the people living that history. So we want to know, how did people in the past see and solve problems? For one thing, before the 20th century, the disciplines weren't divided into physics, biology, geology, chemistry, and so on the way we think of it now. Instead, discoveries tended to happen within the construct of social needs, desires, and problems, the things that people chose to solve. Patricia Farah's book corrects the idea that science only happened in the West. It certainly developed and traveled all the way around the world. This is a view looking out over Constantinople, Istanbul, at the Hagia Sophia. This is a connection between East and West that gathered armies and treasures and ideas. Step back and out from the geographic gateway and take a longer look, and you can see that the Middle Ages were not so much isolated as they were connected at a much slower pace. This map, compiled by graduate student Martin Van Manson, shows the trade routes used in the Middle Ages. It's a real labor of love, and it's busy. Even though many people didn't ever travel far, you can see that for some, there are routes that will take you all the way across Europe and into the East. If you've ever done a walking tour across an older landscape, for instance, England, you'll know that small settlements are spaced out about a mile apart, about 20 minutes apart. At 3 miles an hour, a person can walk between 15 and 20 miles in a day, more or less, depending on what is being carried and if there's a group or not. And as a side note, in a walking, riding, and sailing society, you can see why having traditions of open-to-all hospitality a place to sleep and some food if possible, might be considered a civic and humanitarian duty that an organization like a monastery was expected to carry out. What I wanted you to see, against the backdrop of that map, is something about the way science and technology travel. Scholars of material culture have been surprised and fascinated to see that what we might think of as a Scottish design in cloth, tartans, actually appear in Western China. On the left is a fragment displayed in the Naturhistorisches Museum in Vienna. It was preserved and found in the salt mines of Hallstatt, Austria, and it's dated to around 1000 BCE. On the right is a fragment found in an ancient cemetery in western China in the Tarim Basin, and it's dated to around 1400 BCE. How did it get there? In the Tarim Basin are a series of graves with mummies. Not intentional mummies, these were preserved accidentally by the dry climate. They are 6 foot tall and blonde and red-haired and wore tartans and were tattooed, and they are the people who helped carry that cloth-making skill set. They were, as you might expect, a real surprise to historians and explorers. So the map, together with the fragments, show that people and ideas who share skills in a knowledge base can and do move over large areas. As I mentioned to you, I typically put a squirrel on something where I've put a number of links, and if you want to know more about this, you can find a whole lot more detail in Elizabeth Wayland Barber's book, The Mummies of Urumqi, and also the University of Pennsylvania website. I've also linked a talk by mummy expert Victor Mayer of the University of Pennsylvania, and I've included a link to a museum in western China where these mummies are located, and just as a bonus, I've put in a link to a fun fan site. Now here's one other example of exchange, but it's a little bit later. This grave is dated to around the 4th century CE, or at least 1,000 years later. And this mummy is also from the Tarim Basin in western China, but it represents Roman trade. This beautiful silkwork probably moved along the trading routes from city to city, bringing these valued goods from the west to the east. Yingpan Man, as he is known from the location he was found, is wearing a brilliant red silk coat. Heather Pringle, who is the journalist and historian who wrote about the Yingpan Man for Archaeology magazine a little while ago, said this: "The woolen kaftan, for example, is a masterpiece in double weave. It portrays a small army of little golden Greco-Roman putti, that they resemble cherubim, and sacrificial bulls on a red background. You can also see paired goats. There's the cherubim, and there are the goats, and there's a little bit closer look at the bulls." She adds that textile expert Elizabeth Barber, a professor emerita from the Occidental College in Los Angeles, believes that the weavers in Eastern Roman Empire made the kaftan and then traded it eastward into the Tarim Basin. Oh, forgot to circle the bulls there. Now let's move to China itself to have a look at some of the technologies developed in non-Western contexts. China is home to some incredible and visionary projects. The Dujian River system, the building of the Great Wall, and the creation of the Terracotta Warriors all occur around 220 to 200 BCE. Now, how can you connect this to what you may know? Well, the Chinese are doing these kinds of things. Rome is fighting Carthage. It's before Caesar, before the Roman Empire, but after Alexander the Great. It's the time when the Greek ideas about those 4 elements and the organization of the heavens are being developed. Now, these 3 items, the Great Wall and the Terracotta Soldiers and the Dujiang River system, are not associated, well, they're associated more with highly organized empires than you might say with the development of science. But I think there are good reasons to see these projects within the frame of science as problem solving and predicting. So if you look on the map on the right here, you see 2 major rivers cutting across China. The lower and the longer one is the Yangtze River. On the left is the Dujiangyan River irrigation system. It's part of the Min River, which joins the Yangtze River. The Min River pours down from the mountains into the Yangtze River near Chengdu, which is a city which is represented by the blue star on the map. The water comes down pretty fast in spring, and in the past it flooded periodically, washing away crops and people and creating great suffering instead of plenty. It was a persistent, perennial, enormous problem. How to solve it? Well, Li Bing, an administrator in the Qin dynasty, was appointed to this district, and he needed to tackle this problem. He solved it by building an inner, that's marked with a 1, and outer, marked with a 2, channel. And then the inner is a swift and deep, and the outer is broad and shallow. And the outer shifts the water so that it doesn't flood and it doesn't clog up, and it does deposit the silt. And this is the key thing. It's still functioning 2,000 years later. A series of dams and levees cross the channel, and the whole thing allows water to flow but not overflow. And it does ensure that crops can be grown and people can live in safety along the banks of this river. I have spun the image around so that you can see how the river was split into an inner section and an outer section on the far right. And you can also see the middle branch in the satellite photo here. The red star on the same spot is the same on both maps. It is a temple to honor the engineer Li Bing. Now, how great is that for history of science? An engineer who gets his own temple. Okay, and here are the rivers marked again, and the spillover. It's just hard to comprehend how big this is unless you look at Google Earth, and you can still see it from 20 miles up. So moving forward a little bit, Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of the Qin dynasty, was from 259 to 210, roughly the same time period, had an extraordinary life. He started his career at the age of 13 when his father died, and by the age of 22, he had assumed the rulership of China, of his part of China anyway, fully. And by the age of 38, he had conquered all the surrounding states and created a unified empire with standard measures, taxes, a coinage system, defensive walls, and irrigation systems. Also, he had begun his own massive tomb. He was obsessed with long life, the color black, standardizing everything, and was, at least by later reputation, unafraid to kill his enemies. Now, he did not build all of the Great Wall, or even all of the stretches of the Great Wall. They cut across China. They were added to by many other dynasties, but he started it, and he strengthened and fortified the northern wall against the northern invading peoples, which included the Huns. And we just need something to see how massive this work was. So giving you this on the lower slide, this red line showing the Qin dynasty wall snaking across the landscape and the mountaintops. It's an incredible project that requires manpower, engineering skill, the ability to mobilize people to do it. Now here's a later, more familiar view. This is the Ming Dynasty section of the wall. It's been repaired, and this is where tourists typically visit. But if you think about rivers and walls, you know that engineering and management of people and transportation of things, this is something the Chinese had figured out, and in particular, Qin Shi Huang had figured out. Now let's take a moment and think about tombs, something else I mentioned we were going to look at. So last week's lecture included the pyramids, big tombs built around 2500 BCE. Now the Chinese civilization is kind of pulling itself together a little bit later as far as writing goes. About 1500 BCE, artists, mostly anonymous, are making these amazing set of bronzes and jades, wine vessels, drums, bells, just gorgeous pieces of work. And these are rituals, symbols of the cosmos, symbols of virtue. What you may not know, though, in the context of this beautiful artifacts, is that the Chinese also practiced human sacrifice for many thousands of years as part of a variety of rituals, but particularly including the death of a ruler. It surprised me. This is not something I knew, but when I was reading up on it, I thought, oh, how about that? The numbers of people that they would sacrifice varies, but it's like more than 100 for some rulers. In 383 BCE, the Duke of Qin, who came before Qin Shi Huangdi, whom we're talking about, he attempted to stop human sacrifice by issuing a decree against this practice. So there's some social debate about whether it's right or wrong, and at least one Chinese ruler said, no, it's not a good idea. All right, now here we come to Qin Shi Huangdi, who built these walls and supported massive irrigation projects, and now he's thinking about, and conquered everybody else, he's thinking about his own tomb. He lives about 100 years after the Duke of Qin, who made this no killing people proclamation. So what did he do? Did he stop human sacrifice at his funeral? Probably he did sacrifice some people. But while he was preparing for his death, building a big tomb, he decided to add more than 8,000 soldiers to stand guard in his tomb, each with an individualized face. They're lined up in battalions, generals are at the head, various types of soldiers are in the formation. Now, think about this. You're Qin Shi Huangdi, and you want to make a case for your own magnificence and importance. And you do have a guess that you're not going to be able to sacrifice as many people as you would like to suit your ideas of your own importance. And you would also like some protection from your enemies in the spirit world, which is pretty practical because you've killed a lot of people in your lifetime. So this is what he chooses to do. He chooses to make these soldiers. They were discovered in 1974 by farmers, and they really excited archaeologists. They're stunning in scope. I'm not even mentioning that what we think is his central tomb has never been excavated. This is just the surrounding area. And this is what it looks like in Xi'an, where they now stand, uncovered in the same formation that they were buried. Many of them have been left buried because when you open them up to the air, it instantly erodes this beautiful paint that decorated their armor and accoutrements. The soldiers are difficult to move. The soldiers are difficult to move. They are both heavy and fragile. They were stamped by the workshop that made them. By examining the marks on the statues, we know that there were 80+ workshops. We believe that each workshop made 7 to 10 a year, which suggests that together they were working probably 15 years to do this project. The stamp was for quality control. If something was badly done, it could be traced, and the workshop could be held accountable. The workers used molds for the bodies and sculptured the finer features themselves, and as far as anyone can tell, no two faces are exactly alike. Are they portraits? It seems likely that these incredibly detailed and engaging faces are probably based on something, and maybe they were modeled on the faces of the soldiers, or maybe those who worked in the workshops. For what it's worth, the Chinese themselves match face types to written character types, and you see a little bit of that in these modeled faces. Now, the soldiers carried weapons made of bronze, and they were mass-produced and standardized and polished with rotary lathes. Crossbows in particular had interchangeable parts for the trigger, and they could shoot through armor as far away as half a mile. The crossbow arrows had a higher percentage of tin in the head, which had to be hard, than they did in the shaft, which had to be a little flexible. All these features, which are just being explored now, in other words, the careful casting for the right percentage of tin and the interchangeability of the trigger parts, all of this is currently rewriting the history of weapons and when standardization was invented. We usually say that standardized weapons were invented in the Civil War in America, and that just isn't true. They were invented far earlier in a whole different place and time. One line of thought I'm considering is this. If the emperor demanded perfection of everything, because once it was in the ground you couldn't exactly swap it out for something better, then that demand for perfection would make it more important to make exactly standardized parts. And then what also has got me thinking is this. If you choose to trade some, not all maybe, but some actual sacrifices for clay soldiers, and it takes your fancy to make each soldier individualized, and then you pour enormous energy into doing this, and as far as we know, no one else in the entire world ever before or afterwards took it into their heads to do this, then what happens to the society that carries out this project? When you die, and they've put you in your fabulous tomb, what do they think about doing next? I have no answer, but I do think it might give your society a leg up on carrying out other future ideas in mass production and art. And I've included this squirrel because there are lots and lots of links to interesting things in the notes. There are 4 big inventions that are known to have come from China: paper, printing, the magnet compass, and gunpowder. And they were developed between Qin Shi Huangdi and the next stop we will make, which is the Ming Dynasty and their round-the-world voyages. Now here's another mass production and art example: Chinese paper and printing. On the left is a block print in brown mulberry paper from 1095 in Fuzhou, Fujian province, which is in the south of China. You can just carve out the entire block with a message or a page and then stamp that message or page over and over again. It works quite well, and the Chinese used this method up through the 1700s. It's a great way to disseminate information. On the right is a copy of the Diamond Sutra, Buddhist scriptures from around 800 AD, and it was a scroll that was stamped out. It's sort of a half book, half scroll. And the technology of paper making and printing were both well established in China before the movable type printing press we know from the celebrated Gutenberg press in Europe. Then gunpowder, which takes a mixture of sulfur, carbon, and saltpeter, minerals which are found in the central and eastern China. Now the Chinese figured out an effective mixture for gunpowder in pursuit, or so it is claimed, of an elixir for healing or long life. Now it turns out that they pretty promptly put gunpowder to its more well-known use, and the early ideas they had are kind of ingeniously awful. On the lower left is the first recipe for gunpowder, and 1044 CE, and then on the upper left, a live bird with a lit bag of gunpowder around its neck, known as a firebird, and on the right an ox called the explosive fire ox. Moving forward, about 400 years from paper, printing, and gunpowder, here's a lovely image of the imperial palace of the later Ming dynasty. The Ming put it all together in outward-seeking voyages around the world. Between 1405 and 1433, the Chinese sailed out into the known world. They set out a flotilla of 9-masted junks, huge ships, led by a general and master mariner, and they got all the way to Africa. They came back concluding that they were pretty far ahead of their neighbors, which is a reasonable conclusion. Now their admiral, Zheng He, was an unusual man. Not much is known of him, but here are a few things. He was a Muslim. He was captured by enemy forces in his childhood, castrated, and sold to the Prince of Yan. The two men grew up together. When the prince became the Emperor Yongle, Zheng He's authority and fortunes rose with the new emperor's fortune because they were friends. Now you can see these voyages on the map and how they were armed and what exotic animals they acquired, what kinds of compasses they might have used, and the relative size of the ships compared between Columbus's future ship and Zheng He's ships. The Chinese were rounding Africa and India a little before the Europeans got there, and one of these great historical what-ifs, what if the Europeans had gotten there sooner and these cultures had met sooner? As it happens, the next Ming emperor after Zheng He's time decided to stop funding these expensive voyages and focus on walls and land wars. So that's the tour of China, starting in 200 BCE and ending in 1400 CE. That's when China was turning back inward, but the Europeans were turning outward. Now I'd like to move over to the Arab world, and we're going to begin in 600 CE with the Nabateans. This is actually a picture on the right-hand side of NCC students at Petra. The comparative argument is that China was a place of development that is in some senses standalone, some goods going east, some big ideas and technology going back to the west, but the Arab cultures, by contrast, lived much closer physically to the Greeks and the Romans, and they were the inheritors of scripts, technologies, and ideas that passed from the Greco-Roman world west and back into the Renaissance Europe. And among these are medical ideas. But starting with the Nabateans, who settled in the modern-day area of Jordan around 600 BCE, and who were independent until roughly the Romans conquered that area, had particular expertise in water control. These passageways into Petra were built to be defensible, but also able to carry water in and out of the city, and you can see the channels as you wind your way in. On the left is an evocative statue of a trader leading a camel. Both trader and camel are worn away all but the feet, and there on the right is this water channel. Here's the treasury, famous from Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade. Later earthquakes have wrecked the original water system and how it is now it's unsafe in downpours, but originally this was a well-watered and well-defended place. And as we saw with the Chinese and the Romans, ancient water systems are among the most enduring monuments to the scientific study of large-scale problems. Now the founding of Islam in the 7th century led to besides political strife, important Arabic cultural focal points. Among them were medicine, math, the study of the natural world and stars, and the responsibility of rulers to support these things as state-funded activities. Arabic scholars in general were famous for compiling and observing diseases through hospitals that were funded partly through local mosques and partly through the state. Abu Ali Sina, or in the West, Avicenna, from 980 to 1037 CE, was known as both a physician and as an astronomer. Patricia Farah, the author of our book, mentions one of his most famous works, a 5-volume canon of medicine called the Al-Tasrif. And it was written around the same time that the Normans conquered England, about 1066 AD, and it included close descriptions of diseases and treatments. And just for reference, this is about the same time that gunpowder and printing are being developed in China. Now, schools were associated with mosques, and that's evident in the architecture. This image shows a library housed in an observatory. I really love it. I'd love to go to that library. This is one of several mosques located in the Citadel Castle in Cairo. The mosque contained 4 schools, and each school met in one of the big half-dome areas around a central fountain where worshippers would purify themselves before praying. On the right, you're looking out from one of the study spaces across to one of the other study spaces. And in the center, you're looking at a space for preaching. And the point is, study and worship are intertwined. You are expected to learn and be smart. It's worth reminding ourselves that the Arab and Asian worlds were connected in war and in peace. Islam traveled the Silk Road to become a recognized religion in the Tang dynasty in China, but raiders from the Arab world would also attack Guangzhou in 758 CE. Where the Arab world and the European world collided is through the Crusades, which is a complex set of interactions around war, religion, trade, exchange of scholarship, and brutality. On the right is Emperor Frederick II. He ruled as a king of Sicily, Germany, and Italy, and Jerusalem, as well as being the Holy Roman Emperor, and he was a crusader. Like many of his contemporaries, he got along pretty well with some of his Arab allies and quite badly with others. He spoke 6 languages, had an interest in science, and was repeatedly at war with the Pope. He has an interesting career. He's worth a look all his own. But the relevant point here is that he had an interest in falconry, which led him to consult Arabic scholars who had been invited to his court to assist him with reading Arabic texts on the subject. We might think that falconry is a more minor area of knowledge, but it was a known point of culture and excellence and trade and exchange. Circling back to where we started, ideas are expressed in buildings. Architects dreamed of honoring God by building higher and lighter, almost by incorporating light into the building itself. The Hagia Sophia, begun in 532 AD, is a point along that pathway. And I'm saying, with regard to science, that buildings like this attracted scholars and practitioners solving problems that are essentially science problems. The 2 people who got this commission, Isidore of Miletus and Anthemius of Tralles, both had professional careers as teachers and architects before they were asked to build this. In other words, it was possible to have a career as a mathematician and an architect in the late Roman world. Alexandria in Egypt and Constantinople in Turkey were both places where you could get a job as a mathematician and architect. And they used their knowledge of geometry to create these beautiful domes and half-domes that you can see in this picture, and the ring of lights that was meant to open up the space and make you, the viewer, feel like you were ringed in light. Chartres Cathedral in France, which exemplifies the High Middle Ages and the increasing technology that went into building, is another point along the pathway of light, of buildings and science and religion working hand in hand. And then you can see Notre Dame from the same time and tradition, and we can end our tall building tour with Strasbourg Cathedral, which was in France, begun in 1277 and finished in 1647, and it was the tallest building in the world until stone building in the world until 1874, when another taller cathedral was built. Let's wrap up this lecture with an idea I call table for one. There are 3 ways to think about the table for one. First is the person who cannot or does not pass along skills and knowledge. This is a skull that had a hole drilled in it. It comes from Switzerland around 3500 BCE. The person who had this hole drilled in their skull lived. This operation is called a trephination, and there are skulls as old as 6000 BCE with these trephination holes. No one knows really how they managed this operation and how people lived after the operation, or why they undertook this medical remedy in the first place. So if you have a bright idea, write it down. Second is someone who personally drives an agenda. Elon Musk and Qin Huangdi are quite different people from quite different contexts, but they have this in common: their reputation for having a vision and the ability to mobilize a lot of people to carry it out. In the process, they have made scientific advances. But if you're the driving force of that vision, then you are seated at a table for one. And by the way, if you'd like to see a 15-minute video on the satellite network run by Elon Musk, there's a fascinating overview, and I've put a link in the notes. Third, there are those who are not invited to the table. They are seated to the side by themselves. When we look at drivers of change and why change did or did not happen, we need to look not only at the places where energy was poured in, but also where and how there were barriers. Who sets the agenda for problems and who follows up? Some are excluded because they are a person not expected to have expertise. Barbara McClintock won a Nobel Prize, but her mother initially discouraged her from going to college, and her colleagues initially dismissed her early work. Eventually, from her mother to her colleagues, they all caught up with her breakthrough ideas. But sometimes people are told to stand aside. And sometimes people are told to stand aside because their ideas require enormous institutional change, or because there's no current evidence for their ideas. But like every other field, there are people. Next, we will look at some adventurers and consider whether or not they belong in the line of science. Here we have John Dee, who was a mathematician and an ardent collector of books, who was also a magician and someone who talked to angels. And we'll think about him next.